The biggest mistake in the room was assuming the waitress could not understand them. The words would not be spoken until much later, but on that evening in downtown Chicago, they were already true. Rain slid slowly down the massive glass windows of the Sterling Room, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. Beyond the glass, thousands of lights stretched across the skyline like scattered diamonds. Inside, the atmosphere felt warm, elegant, and expensive. Crystal chandeliers reflected off polished marble floors. Soft piano music drifted through the dining room. Every table seemed occupied by people discussing opportunities worth millions of dollars. Yet at the largest private dining table in the restaurant, even greater stakes were in play. Victoria Sterling sat at the center of the room. At 47 years old, she had built one of the most influential technology companies in America. Business magazines called her brilliant. Investors called her fearless. Competitors called her impossible to beat. Tonight, however, none of those titles mattered. Across the table sat a delegation of executives and investors from Japan. Months of negotiations had led to this dinner. If all went well, a partnership worth hundreds of millions of dollars would move forward before the night ended. Victoria listened carefully as presentations continued. Her navy business suit was immaculate. Her posture remained confident. Yet behind her calm expression, she was studying every word, every glance, every hesitation. Years in business had taught her something important. Deals were rarely won by the smartest person in the room. They were won by the person who noticed what everyone else missed. A few feet away, Naomi Brooks moved quietly between tables carrying trays and serving guests. Her black apron and white uniform blended naturally into the restaurant environment. Most people barely noticed her. That was normal. Waitresses were expected to be invisible, efficient, professional, easy to overlook. Naomi had learned long ago that people revealed far more than they intended when they believed nobody was paying attention. She placed sparkling water beside one of the Japanese executives and offered a polite smile before stepping away. The conversation at Victoria's table continued. Financial forecasts, market expansion, long-term growth opportunities. Everything sounded positive. Everything sounded exactly as expected. Yet something about the room felt different tonight. Victoria could sense it. She could not explain why. Every presentation appeared polished. Every projection looked promising. But instincts rarely appeared without reason. Across the table, one of the Japanese executives leaned toward another and quietly began speaking in Japanese. The conversation lasted only a few seconds. Nobody reacted. Several advisors continued reviewing documents. Others checked notes on tablets. Victoria maintained a polite expression, though she understood almost none of the exchange. The executive smiled when he finished speaking. Another executive nodded. Then they returned to English as if nothing unusual had happened. Naomi heard every word. She continued walking without changing her expression. A few minutes later, another private exchange occurred. Again, Japanese voices. Again, only a few seconds. Again, nobody reacted. Except Naomi. This time her eyes shifted briefly toward the table. Only for a moment. Then she looked away. The dinner moved forward. Appetizers arrived. Glasses were refilled. Presentations continued. Around the table, confidence grew. Advisors exchanged optimistic smiles. Investors appeared satisfied. The partnership seemed increasingly certain. Victoria listened carefully, yet the uneasy feeling remained. It was small, barely noticeable, like a distant warning hidden beneath the noise of conversation. Near the service station, Naomi paused while organizing glassware. She replayed the Japanese comments in her mind. Once could be coincidence. Twice might still mean nothing. But now she had heard enough to feel concerned. Very concerned. She looked toward Victoria's table again. The executives appeared relaxed. The advisors seemed comfortable. Nobody suspected anything unusual. Naomi wished she felt the same. Then another Japanese executive leaned closer to his colleague and quietly spoke once more. This time Naomi nearly dropped the glass she was holding. Her eyes widened slightly before she forced herself to remain calm. The sentence had been brief. Only a few words. But those few words changed everything. Naomi slowly set the glass down. Across the room, Victoria continued discussing future plans, completely unaware of what had just been said. Naomi stared toward the private dining table. Her heartbeat quickened, because for the first time that evening, She realized the people speaking Japanese believed nobody in the room could understand them, and they had just revealed something they never intended anyone else to hear. Naomi Brooks stood motionless beside the service station as the conversation replayed in her mind. The words themselves were not loud. They were not dramatic. In fact, nobody else in the restaurant had even noticed them. But Naomi understood exactly why they mattered. One of the Japanese investors had quietly told another that the American side was agreeing to conditions they had not fully explained. Then both men had smiled and returned to the discussion as if nothing unusual had happened. Naomi looked toward Victoria Sterling. The Billionaire CEO remained composed at the center of the table. Her advisors sat around her reviewing reports and financial projections. Everything appeared normal. Yet Naomi could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. She picked up another tray and continued working. For the next 15 minutes, she served guests, refilled water glasses, and delivered plates from the kitchen. Outwardly, she looked exactly like every other waitress in the restaurant. Inside, however, her thoughts were racing. At the private dining table, the negotiations continued. Victoria listened as one of the investors explained future opportunities in the Asian market. The numbers sounded impressive. Growth projections stretched years into the future. Several members of her team nodded approvingly. Yet the uncomfortable feeling remained. Victoria had spent decades making decisions worth millions of dollars. She trusted data. She trusted preparation. More importantly, she trusted her instincts. And her instincts were telling her that something beneath the polished presentation did not fit. Across the table, another brief conversation broke out in Japanese. Once again, the speakers assumed nobody understood them. One executive leaned toward another and quietly laughed. The second man answered with a short sentence that immediately caught Naomi's attention. This time her concern deepened. They were discussing Victoria directly. Not the company. Not the agreement. Victoria herself. Naomi carefully placed a plate in front of a guest and walked away without reacting. She knew better than to draw attention to herself. The executives continued smiling politely whenever they switched back to English. To everyone else, they appeared professional and respectful. But Naomi had now heard enough to recognize a pattern. They were saying different things depending on the language they used. That realization made her uneasy. Meanwhile, Victoria asked a series of questions about implementation timelines. The answers came quickly, almost too quickly. Every concern she raised seemed to receive a perfectly prepared response. Her advisors appeared reassured. The investors appeared confident. Yet confidence alone had never impressed Victoria. She preferred clarity. And clarity felt strangely absent tonight. A few moments later, dessert menus arrived. The atmosphere relaxed slightly. Several people laughed. Glasses were raised. The partnership appeared closer than ever. Then Naomi heard another sentence. This one stopped her cold. She froze for a fraction of a second before forcing herself to continue walking. The investor who spoke it sounded completely relaxed, as if he had no reason to hide what he was saying. Why would he? As far as he knew, nobody nearby could understand a word. Naomi's heart began beating faster. The sentence confirmed her worst suspicion. Whatever was happening at that table, it was bigger than a simple misunderstanding. Much bigger. She glanced toward Victoria again. The CEO was reviewing a summary document while one of her advisors explained several key points. Victoria listened carefully, unaware that a completely different conversation had been unfolding right beside her. Naomi wished she could ignore it. She wished she could convince herself it was none of her business. After all, she was a waitress. The people at that table were executives, investors, attorneys, and corporate leaders. Yet the more she thought about it, the more impossible silence became. Because if she had understood the Japanese correctly, someone at that dinner was deliberately taking advantage of the fact that Victoria could not understand what was being said. Naomi slowly set down the tray she was carrying and looked across the room once more. The investors were smiling. Victoria was listening. Nobody suspected anything. But Naomi knew one thing with absolute certainty. If she remained silent, this dinner would not end the way everyone expected. Victoria Sterling leaned back slightly in her chair and studied the faces around the table. The discussion continued smoothly on the surface. Market projections appeared on tablets. Revenue forecasts moved across presentation slides. Advisors exchanged notes. Investors nodded at the appropriate moments. Yet the uncomfortable feeling refused to disappear. It was as if she were listening to a song with one wrong note hidden somewhere beneath the melody. Nobody else seemed to hear it. Across the room, Naomi Brooks carried a fresh tray of coffee toward the private dining area. Her expression remained professional, calm, controlled. But inside, a battle was unfolding. She knew what she had heard. More importantly, she knew what it meant. The Japanese executives were not merely discussing strategy among themselves. They were speaking as though the outcome of the meeting had already been decided, as though Victoria's approval was little more than a formality. Naomi carefully placed a coffee cup beside one of the investors. "Thank you," he said politely. Naomi smiled and stepped away. The investor immediately turned toward a colleague and spoke a few words in Japanese. Once again, he assumed nobody nearby could understand him. Naomi nearly stopped walking. The sentence was brief, but it confirmed everything. The man was openly discussing how certain details would be explained later, after the agreement had already moved forward. Not hidden forever, just delayed long enough to secure cooperation. Naomi continued toward the kitchen, her pulse quickening. Meanwhile, Victoria listened as another executive described future leadership opportunities within the partnership. The words sounded positive, encouraging, yet she noticed something strange. Every time she asked a direct question about long-term authority or decision-making structures, the answers became vague. Not dishonest, just incomplete. That bothered her. Victoria had spent years navigating international business. Experienced negotiators often revealed more through avoidance than through answers. One of her senior advisors leaned toward her. "Everything looks strong," he whispered. Victoria nodded politely. "It does." The advisor smiled. "You still seem unconvinced." Victoria glanced toward the investors. "I am still listening." The answer surprised him. She offered no further explanation. Across the dining room, Naomi stood near the service station staring at a stack of menus she was not really seeing. Memories surfaced unexpectedly. Classrooms in Kyoto. Long afternoons studying language and culture. Teachers insisting that meaning often lived between words rather than inside them. Naomi understood Japanese fluently, but understanding language was only part of the skill. Context mattered. Tone mattered. Intention mattered. And the intention behind the comments she had heard was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Back at the table, laughter broke out after one investor shared a story from a previous business trip. The atmosphere relaxed. Glasses were raised. Several participants looked ready to celebrate. Yet Victoria noticed something else. Whenever the conversation became casual, the Japanese executives seemed comfortable. Whenever specific details about future governance appeared, subtle tension returned. Small changes, barely visible, but visible nonetheless. Then it happened again. Another quiet exchange in Japanese. This time one executive glanced briefly toward Victoria before speaking. His colleague smiled. Both men lowered their voices. Naomi heard every word. The tray in her hands suddenly felt heavier. The sentence was not insulting. It was worse. It was confident. Too confident. They were discussing Victoria as if she were already committed, as if she would never question what came next. Naomi slowly exhaled. The room around her continued moving normally. Guests enjoyed dinner. Servers carried plates. Piano music floated softly through the restaurant. Yet for Naomi, everything had changed. She realized she was no longer deciding whether something was wrong. She was deciding whether to do something about it. Across the room, Victoria turned another page in the proposal and paused. A single paragraph caught her attention. Not because of what it said, because of what it failed to say. Her eyes narrowed slightly. At that exact moment, Naomi looked toward the table. Their eyes met for only a second. But in that second, Naomi saw something unexpected. Victoria had sensed it too. She did not know the language being spoken. She did not know the secret conversations taking place around her. Yet somehow, she already knew that something about this dinner was not what it appeared to be. Victoria Sterling continued staring at the paragraph that had caught her attention. The wording itself was not alarming. In fact, it looked perfectly ordinary. Yet after years of negotiating complex international agreements, she had learned that what was missing from a document could be just as important as what appeared on the page. She looked up. Around the table, the investors remained relaxed. Their smiles never faded. Their answers remained polished. Their confidence remained steady. Almost too steady. Across the room, Naomi Brooks stood near the service station wrestling with a decision. Her instincts told her she needed to speak. Her experience told her to be careful. This was not her meeting. These were not her clients. One wrong move could cost her job. Yet every minute that passed made silence more difficult. The comments she had overheard were becoming impossible to ignore. Another round of coffee arrived at the table. Naomi picked up the tray herself. As she approached, she noticed one of the Japanese executives leaning toward a colleague. Their voices dropped once again into Japanese. Naomi set a cup down quietly and listened without appearing to listen. The executive smiled as he spoke. His colleague nodded. Then both men glanced briefly toward Victoria before returning their attention to the discussion. Naomi felt her stomach tighten. The meaning was clear. They were counting on assumptions. They were counting on nobody questioning certain details until much later. She stepped away from the table and stopped near the entrance to the private room. For several seconds, she simply watched. Victoria was now asking more direct questions. The answers continued to arrive quickly. Too quickly. One investor responded before another had even finished speaking. It felt rehearsed, coordinated, as if everyone had practiced the conversation beforehand. Victoria noticed it too. Her expression remained professional, but she had become more cautious. She closed the proposal and folded her hands. The room grew quieter. "I would like clarification regarding future oversight authority," she said calmly. One executive immediately answered. "The structure is outlined in the final implementation documents." Victoria nodded. "Which documents specifically?" For the first time all evening, a slight hesitation appeared. Only a second, barely noticeable, but Victoria saw it. So did Naomi. The executive recovered quickly and named several attachments. The meeting moved forward. Yet something had shifted. Confidence was slowly being replaced by scrutiny. Naomi realized this might be her only opportunity. If she waited until after the agreement was signed, it could be too late. She took a slow breath. Then another. Her heart pounded as she stepped toward the table. Nobody noticed her at first. Why would they? She was a waitress carrying a small tray. One more employee moving through the room. Then she stopped beside Victoria's chair. The conversation faded. Several people looked up. Naomi immediately felt dozens of eyes on her. "Excuse me," she said softly. One advisor frowned. Another looked confused. Victoria turned toward her. "Yes." Naomi hesitated for a fraction of a second. Every instinct told her to walk away. Instead, she chose honesty. "I apologize for interrupting." The room remained silent. "But I believe there may be information relevant to this discussion." Several executives exchanged puzzled looks. One advisor looked irritated. Victoria studied Naomi carefully. There was no arrogance in her voice. No attempt to attract attention. Only concern. "What information?" Victoria asked. Naomi glanced toward the Japanese delegation. The investors suddenly appeared much less comfortable than before. Then Naomi spoke the sentence that changed everything. Not in English. In flawless Japanese. The room froze. One executive nearly dropped his pen. Another stared at her in disbelief. The translator looked completely stunned. For several seconds nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Naomi calmly repeated one of the private statements she had overheard earlier, word for word, exactly as it had been spoken. The color drained from more than one face around the table. Victoria slowly turned toward the investors. The confidence that had filled the room all evening was gone. And for the first time since the dinner began, everyone understood that the waitress nobody had noticed was about to become the most important person in the room. For several long seconds, nobody said a word. The private dining room that had been filled with confident conversation now felt completely different. Every eye remained fixed on Naomi Brooks. The waitress stood quietly beside the table, her black apron still tied neatly at her waist, showing none of the triumph that many people expected. She had not spoken to impress anyone. She had spoken because the truth mattered. Victoria Sterling watched the reactions around the room carefully. The Japanese executives who had appeared so relaxed moments earlier were suddenly tense. One investor adjusted his glasses. Another reached for a document in front of him. A third avoided eye contact entirely. Victoria noticed every movement. "Would someone like to explain what she just translated?" she asked calmly. Her voice was not angry. That made it far more powerful. One executive forced a polite smile. "I believe there may be some misunderstanding." Naomi remained silent. Victoria turned toward her. Was the translation accurate? Naomi nodded. Yes. The answer was simple, certain, unshakable. Victoria looked back toward the delegation. Then perhaps we should discuss the misunderstanding together. The room grew even quieter. One of Victoria's attorneys opened his laptop. Another advisor began reviewing notes from earlier discussions. Suddenly, comments that had seemed harmless no longer felt harmless at all. Naomi could see the shift happening in real time. Questions that nobody had considered before were now becoming important. Why had certain topics only been discussed privately? Why had answers become vague whenever governance and authority were mentioned? Why had some executives seemed so confident that the agreement would be approved without further examination? One of the investors cleared his throat. The comments were informal. They were taken out of context. Naomi spoke carefully. Then perhaps you can provide the context. The response surprised everyone. Not because it was aggressive, because it was reasonable. The investor opened his mouth, then closed it again. Victoria noticed that too. Across the table, her chief legal advisor leaned forward. I would like to revisit the implementation documents mentioned earlier. Another attorney agreed immediately. Files began opening. Pages were compared. References were checked. The atmosphere of celebration had disappeared completely. In its place stood scrutiny. Naomi stepped back slightly, hoping to avoid becoming the center of attention. Unfortunately, that was no longer possible. One advisor looked directly at her. How long have you spoken Japanese? Naomi hesitated. Many years. Fluently. Naomi nodded. Yes. The advisor looked stunned. Several others appeared equally surprised. Victoria studied Naomi carefully. There was something remarkable about the way she carried herself. No arrogance. No need for recognition. Just confidence rooted in knowledge. The kind of confidence that comes from understanding something deeply. A few minutes later, one of the attorneys suddenly stopped scrolling through a document. Victoria. His tone immediately drew attention. What is it? He turned the screen toward her. There is a reference here that was never discussed. Victoria looked closer. The document contained a cross-reference to a supplemental governance schedule. Nothing unusual at first glance. Yet the schedule itself was not attached. Where is the referenced attachment? She asked. Nobody answered immediately. The attorney continued searching. Another lawyer joined him. Within moments, several members of Victoria's team were examining the same section. The missing attachment had become the most important document in the room. Across the table, discomfort spread visibly among the investors. Naomi noticed it immediately. So did Victoria. The billionaire CEO slowly closed the folder in front of her and folded her hands. I think we should locate that schedule before discussing anything further. Nobody objected. In fact, nobody seemed eager to speak at all. The confidence that had dominated the evening was rapidly disappearing. Naomi watched as attorneys exchanged increasingly concerned looks. Whatever was hidden inside the missing attachment, it mattered. A lot. Then one of the legal advisors finally found a related file buried within a larger collection of supporting documents. He opened it. His eyes widened almost instantly. The room waited. Victoria watched him carefully. What did you find? The attorney looked up from the screen, his expression suddenly serious. I think we just discovered why those private conversations mattered so much. The attorney slowly turned the screen so everyone at the table could see it. The room remained silent except for the distant sound of rain against the windows. Victoria Sterling leaned forward. Several advisors stood behind her chair. Across the table, the Japanese executives appeared increasingly uneasy. Explain it, Victoria said. The attorney nodded. This supplemental governance schedule creates a different authority structure than the one described in the main presentation. He scrolled through several pages. The language is subtle, but if implemented exactly as written, major strategic decisions would gradually shift away from your company. A chill seemed to pass through the room. Victoria studied the document carefully. How gradual? She asked. Another attorney joined the review. Slow enough that most people would not notice immediately. Fast enough to become significant within a few years. Several members of Victoria's team exchanged worried looks. The partnership had been presented as balanced, collaborative, mutually beneficial. Yet the document suggested something very different. Across the room, Naomi Brooks listened quietly. She had never intended to become part of this meeting. Her goal had simply been to prevent a mistake. Now she watched as professionals uncovered layer after layer of information that should have been discussed from the beginning. One investor finally spoke. You are interpreting the document incorrectly. Victoria looked toward him. Then help us understand it correctly. The investor hesitated. For the first time all evening, he seemed uncertain. That uncertainty told Victoria more than any explanation could have. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was gone. Questions continued. Answers became shorter. Attorneys reviewed additional files. References led to other references. Supporting documents revealed further details. Nothing appeared illegal. Nothing appeared dramatic. Yet together the provisions painted a concerning picture. Important authority would eventually move into the hands of committees that Victoria's company would not fully control. Decision-making power would become increasingly diluted. Revenue allocations could be adjusted through mechanisms barely mentioned in the primary proposal. Everything had been technically disclosed, yet almost nothing had been clearly highlighted. Why was this never discussed directly? One advisor asked. Nobody offered a convincing answer. Victoria folded her hands and leaned back in her chair. Years of leadership had taught her an important lesson. The most dangerous problems were rarely obvious. They hid behind complexity. They survived because people assumed someone else had already reviewed them. Across the table, one executive attempted to redirect the conversation toward future opportunities. Victoria stopped him immediately. No, her voice remained calm. We are discussing this first. The room fell silent again. Near the service station, several restaurant employees watched discreetly, sensing that something important was happening. None of them understood the details. Yet everyone could feel the change in the atmosphere. Naomi remained standing quietly near the entrance. She hoped attention would move away from her. Instead, it seemed to increase. One of Victoria's senior advisors looked toward her. You recognized something was wrong before any of us did. Naomi shifted slightly. I only understood the conversations. That was enough. Another attorney nodded in agreement. More than enough. Victoria turned toward Naomi. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Victoria asked a simple question. Where did you learn Japanese? Naomi hesitated. The answer was personal, yet something told her honesty was the right choice. I spent several years studying and living in Japan. Several people around the table looked surprised. Victoria's curiosity deepened. A waitress who spoke flawless Japanese was already unexpected. A waitress who understood the language well enough to recognize business implications was something else entirely. Victoria glanced back at the documents scattered across the table. Then she looked at Naomi again. The feeling that she had not yet heard the full story suddenly became impossible to ignore. And as the attorneys continued reviewing the agreement, Victoria realized she was becoming just as interested in the woman who uncovered the problem as she was in the problem itself. The rain outside had begun to fade, but inside the private dining room the tension continued to grow. Documents covered nearly every section of the long conference table. Attorneys compared notes. Advisors reviewed attachments. The investors who had arrived expecting a celebration now found themselves answering questions they had never planned to face. Victoria Sterling remained remarkably calm. Years earlier, she might have reacted emotionally. Experience had taught her something more valuable. When the truth begins to surface, patience becomes power. She listened carefully as her legal team continued reviewing the supplemental governance schedules. Every new discovery reinforced the same conclusion. The agreement was far different from the partnership originally described. Not openly deceptive, but structured in a way that would gradually weaken her company's influence over time. Across the table, one executive attempted another explanation. These provisions are standard in many international agreements. Victoria nodded politely. Then they should have been easy to explain from the beginning. Nobody answered immediately. The silence itself felt revealing. Nearby, Naomi Brooks remained standing quietly near the entrance of the room. She wanted to disappear back into her normal responsibilities. Instead, the attention around her continued growing. Every few minutes, someone glanced in her direction. The waitress who had entered the evening unnoticed had become impossible to ignore. One attorney closed a file and looked toward Victoria. The more we review this structure, the more concerns appear. Another advisor agreed. Important authority transfers would not happen immediately. They would happen gradually through committee decisions and procedural approvals. Victoria folded her arms thoughtfully, meaning most people would not recognize the shift until it was already established. Exactly. Several members of the Japanese delegation exchanged nervous looks. The confidence that had defined the evening was gone. For the first time, Victoria felt she fully understood the situation. Earlier, she had sensed something was wrong without knowing why. Now she knew. The missing information, the private conversations, the vague answers. Each piece fit together, not as a dramatic conspiracy, as a carefully designed strategy hidden behind complexity. Victoria looked directly at the lead investor. If Naomi had not spoken tonight, would anyone have pointed us toward these schedules? The question landed heavily. The investor hesitated. Then he looked away. Victoria already had her answer. Around the room, several advisors quietly shook their heads. Some appeared frustrated. Others appeared relieved. Relief often arrives when uncertainty finally receives a name. One of Victoria's senior consultants turned toward Naomi. You recognize the significance of those conversations immediately. Naomi offered a small smile. Not immediately. The consultant looked surprised. Naomi continued. I listened. Then I listened again. I wanted to be certain before saying anything. Victoria noticed the answer. It revealed something important. Naomi had not acted recklessly. She had acted responsibly. That distinction mattered. Across the table, another attorney reopened one of the translated documents. There is something else. Everyone looked up. Several phrases were translated accurately, but the business implications were softened significantly in the summary version. Victoria frowned, meaning, the words are technically correct. The interpretation presented to us is far more favorable than the underlying language suggests. A heavy silence settled across the room. Victoria slowly exhaled. Every discovery pointed in the same direction. The agreement was built on assumptions. Assumptions that nobody would examine every layer. Assumptions that language barriers would remain barriers. Assumptions that people would trust appearances. Tonight, every one of those assumptions had failed. Victoria turned toward Naomi once more. The waitress stood quietly in her black apron, looking far more comfortable than many executives seated around the table. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Wealth, titles, experience. None of them had uncovered the problem first. Knowledge had, and knowledge had arrived wearing a server's uniform. Then one of the attorneys received a message on his laptop. He read it quickly before looking toward Victoria. We completed the background search you requested. Victoria raised an eyebrow. And the attorney glanced toward Naomi. I think there is much more to her story than anyone here realizes. The room seemed smaller now, not because anything had changed physically, but because every assumption that had filled it earlier had begun to disappear. Victoria Sterling looked at the attorney who had just received the background report. Around the table, conversations stopped once again. The Japanese delegation remained silent. Her advisors waited. Even Naomi Brooks appeared surprised. Victoria gestured toward the attorney. Go ahead. The attorney glanced at Naomi before looking back at the screen. The information is public. We simply never had a reason to look. Naomi shifted uncomfortably. She was not accustomed to being the subject of discussion in rooms like this. The attorney continued. Naomi earned a degree in international business and East Asian studies. She graduated with honors. Several people stared at her. One advisor blinked twice as if he had heard incorrectly. Honors? Naomi nodded slightly. Yes. The attorney continued reading. She also spent several years in Japan through academic and professional exchange programs. The room remained silent. Victoria leaned back in her chair. Suddenly many things made sense. Naomi had not merely understood the language. She had understood the business implications hidden beneath the language. That required much more than vocabulary. One consultant shook his head in disbelief. Why are you working as a waitress? Naomi smiled politely. Because life does not always follow the plans we make. Nobody laughed. The answer carried too much truth. Victoria studied her carefully. The woman standing beside the door was nothing like the assumptions people had made about her. Then again, perhaps she had always been exactly who she was. Everyone else had simply failed to notice. Across the table, one of the investors attempted to redirect the discussion. Perhaps we should focus on the agreement. Victoria looked at him calmly. We are. The response ended the conversation immediately. Attorneys continued reviewing the documents. The deeper they looked, the more questions emerged. Certain provisions required clarification. Several governance mechanisms needed restructuring. Multiple sections would have to be renegotiated entirely. The agreement that had seemed ready for approval only hours earlier now appeared incomplete at best. One of Victoria's senior legal advisors finally closed his laptop. I recommend we suspend all approval discussions until every issue is resolved. Another attorney agreed. Then another. Within minutes, the recommendation became unanimous. Victoria looked around the table. Earlier that evening, everyone had expected signatures. Now nobody expected them. The difference between those two outcomes could be measured in a single decision. The decision to speak. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The city lights reflected beautifully across the windows overlooking Chicago. Inside, a different kind of clarity had arrived. One by one, the investors began gathering their materials. Their confidence had vanished. The atmosphere of celebration had vanished with it. Victoria remained composed. She thanked everyone for attending. She made no accusations. She raised no voice. Facts no longer required drama. The facts spoke for themselves. As the meeting slowly came to an end, Victoria walked toward Naomi. The waitress looked uncertain. "Did I cause problems?" she asked quietly. Victoria almost smiled. "No." She glanced toward the stacks of documents still spread across the table. "I think you prevented them." For the first time all evening, Naomi allowed herself to relax slightly. Yet Victoria's attention remained fixed on her. The more she learned about Naomi, the more questions she had. Not about the agreement. About Naomi herself. Because people with her education, her discipline, and her insight rarely appeared by accident. Victoria had a feeling there was still part of the story she had not heard. And as the last members of the delegation prepared to leave, she decided she intended to find out exactly who Naomi Brooks really was. The private dining room gradually emptied as the evening came to an end. The investors departed quietly. Attorneys gathered documents. Advisors packed laptops and folders. The excitement that had filled the room hours earlier had been replaced by reflection. Outside, Chicago shimmered beneath a clear night sky. The storm had passed. Inside, another storm had passed as well. Victoria Sterling stood near the windows overlooking the city. She watched the final members of her team leave before turning toward Naomi Brooks. The waitress was collecting empty glasses and preparing to return to her normal responsibilities. Nothing about her appearance suggested that she had just altered the outcome of one of the most important business meetings of the year. Her black apron was still neatly tied. Her posture remained calm. She moved with the same quiet professionalism she had displayed all evening. Victoria found that remarkable. Most people would have been eager for recognition. Naomi seemed content simply knowing she had done the right thing. Naomi. Naomi looked up. "Yes." Victoria walked toward her. "Can I ask you something?" Naomi nodded. "Of course." Victoria glanced around the nearly empty room. "Why did you speak up?" Naomi seemed surprised by the question. For a moment, she considered her answer carefully. "Because it was the truth." Victoria smiled slightly. Most people would have stayed silent. Naomi looked toward the table where the documents still rested. "Maybe." Then she shrugged gently. "But if I knew something important and said nothing, I would have remembered that decision for the rest of my life." The answer lingered in the room. Victoria understood it immediately. Some choices become part of who we are. Silence would have been easier. Speaking had been harder. Naomi chose the harder path. Across the room, one of Victoria's attorneys approached with several final reports. "The review is complete." Victoria accepted the documents. And every concern Naomi helped uncover was legitimate. The attorney shook his head slowly. If the agreement had been approved tonight, the long-term consequences could have been significant. Victoria nodded. She already suspected as much. The attorney glanced toward Naomi. "She probably saved your company years of problems." Naomi lowered her eyes slightly, uncomfortable with the attention. Victoria noticed that too. She thanked the attorney and waited until he left. Then she turned back toward Naomi. "You know, everyone in this room noticed your intelligence tonight." Naomi smiled softly. "That was never the goal." "I know." Victoria looked toward the city lights beyond the glass. Which is probably why it mattered. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. The restaurant had become quiet. The piano music had stopped. Only distant sounds from the kitchen remained. Finally, Victoria extended her hand. Naomi looked at it briefly before shaking it. The gesture carried no business strategy, no publicity, no transaction. It was simple respect. "Thank you," Victoria said. Naomi nodded. "You are welcome." As they released hands, Victoria realized something important. All evening people had assumed influence belonged to the richest person in the room. They assumed power belonged to executives, investors, and advisors. Yet the person who changed everything had not been sitting at the table. She had been serving it. Naomi gathered the last tray and prepared to leave. Victoria watched her walk toward the restaurant doors. The waitress disappeared into the hallway, returning to a life that looked ordinary from the outside. But Victoria knew better now. The most extraordinary qualities often hide behind ordinary appearances. As the final lights reflected across the empty glasses and polished wood, Victoria looked once more at the abandoned agreement lying on the table. Then she smiled. The partnership had not been saved. It had been stopped. And that was exactly why the future remained protected. Sometimes the smartest person in the room is not the one giving the presentation. Sometimes it is the one everyone overlooks. And on that night in Chicago, wisdom arrived wearing a waitress apron.